I think everybody can hear everybody now. Thanks everybody for joining. Sorry about the technical difficulties. And great to have Bill here for our fourth reading club. I think it's a really great topic to have because it's something that I think RiskWi is still grappling with 2 decades after Bill wrote this paper, around how to do some of these things, the balance and approach, and developing these schools of thought that don't really go anywhere and otherwise. So thanks, Bill, for agreeing to present. And over to you.
Risk makes farming worth doing. Risk creates return. Risk creates return, makes farming worth doing. Can you hear me? It's a good question. Okay. Now, Australian agriculture, you all know it's riskier than pretty much anything else you might care to do. And 20 years ago, I wrote that paper. I love the idea of a reading group. I think that's brilliant. And I'm even naive enough to think that some of you may even have actually read the paper. But if you haven't, I'll sketch the guts of it. But I want to then talk about where my thinking has got to. And then we'll throw it open for questions and answers, okay? Now, Dave Panel's responsible for this. He asked me a few years, 20 years ago, he was president of the Ag Eco Society, and said, write a paper, will you, about something about farm management, something that people might understand or like to hear. And so I wrote this farm management economic analysis, a few disciplines, a few perspectives, a few figurings, and a few futures. And I was totally indulgent, absolutely indulgent with Dave's permission. And I went for broke. I started it with some of my heroes. The first one was T.W. Schultz, who made the point that needs to be remade, that what matters is time and dynamics. Running a farm system is not static, right? Constant change, dynamics. And T.W. Schultz made enormous contributions in many areas, but that to me was a big one. He's sort of the founder of farm management economics to me. But the second one, my second hero was Arthur Huey Davis, known as Steel Rudd. And I had to put that in about Joe doing the sums. I still laugh when I read it now. I think it's hilarious. And it even rings true now because I find my students, current students, cannot do simple sums. They're no better than Joe Rudd. And these all relate to what's in the paper, mind you. The third one was just Lance Scuthorpe's Champion Bullock Driver. And to me, that's just such a wonderful Australian short story. I had to use it regardless of context. Then I had to dream up a pretend context that made it relevant to the paper. But the image, I still laugh, the image of the Champion Bullock Driver with the whip flashing and the language going and the post and rail fence getting up and moving. Like that still makes me laugh and captures my imagination. And imagination is really important because we're dealing with risk, we're dealing with the future. We can't know the future, we can't remember the future, as John Dillon said, but we have to imagine it. So that's how I linked Lance Scuthorpe's story in, but I wanted it out there so people won't forget it. And I did the same with some of the expressions I used in the paper, which mystified some people, but some old Australian terms in the paper. What did I mean by few disciplines? That comes from Kenneth Boulding's general systems theory, where to solve a problem, you need the optimal degree of generality. And the optimal degree of mix of disciplines, the balance of disciplines depends on the problem at hand. But I often see one discipline that's missing that's close to my heart is farm economics. And I'm saying, well, that's actually at the centre of the problem-solving mix of disciplines you need. A few perspectives. The truth doesn't come to us in one angle. And I find looking at a problem from a number of angles, you've got a better chance of solving it. And so like there's the human, the technical, the economic, the finance, the risk beyond the farm. We've got to put all those bits together, look at it from all those angles. And also asking the question, what if I'm wrong? What if it is not like I understand it to be? That's coming at a question from a few angles, other than assuming I know. A few figurings, really powerful sums. Where I got to that was coming through the New England in the 70s, very mathematically modelling minded system simulation, decision theory, And I sort of studied it, and I come to the conclusion that by focusing on the sort of very econometric type approaches, we can actually lose sight of what some of the big picture things, and I'll come back to that. But to me, simple sums that are based firmly on production economic theory and sound economics, simple budgets are really powerful. And Bruce Davidson, Australia's great economist, is an example of what you can do with simple budgets, but sophisticated thinking. And you've got to know that underlying these budgets is a profound body of production economic theory, for instance. So that's where the simple sums come in. You've got to do it a bit better than Joe Rudd did at the start of this paper. And then a few futures. This comes from the simple fact, obvious fact, we simply cannot know. And so what can we do? We can think hard and imagine a few futures, a few outcomes, and think about how they matter. This is in you making decisions about running your business. So that's sort of by way of introduction. My introduction, I guess, to risk. I grew up mallee farming, wheat farming, lived it in the mallee in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, and the farm's still there. And next year it's 100 years, that family farm's still battling on. But I was introduced to risk there. Then I went to New England because I loved agriculture and I loved economics, and I was introduced to decision theory, risky decision analysis, Jack Malcom, John Dillon. That was part of my training. And decision theory in the 70s came out of decision theory in the 50s and 60s in the US. It had people in it because it was based on utility theory plus probability theory. So it had people in it, but the people in it were rational computing machines. And what's changed since those days is we now know that behavioural economics has told us that people are not like that. They have biases, and I'll come back to that. But utility, never getting into people's heads never really resonated with me. And it's the four axioms of utility have been discredited by real scholars like John Quiggin and others. But still, it's about all we've got left with is some guess about people's attitude to risk, right? But what finished me was Jock Anderson and Bob Officer, two really famous and good ag economists. They wrote a paper, and maybe they were joking and I missed the joke, but they actually had the line, I think they were naive enough to believe it, had the line, oh, now we've mastered utility theory, it's the answer to everything. The consultant can have his clients add a utility function on file and make the decision for them. And at that point, I realised what nonsense. And so in the farming game, 1981, Jack Malcom and I wrote, Jack had given it a good run. He said the horse, it was the winner, utility. But we actually reached the position, and I still hold this, instead of trying to get into people's heads and guts with playing games with bloody matches and going around bothering farmers, trying to estimate their utility function, I thought, let's leave that up to them. They know better what's best for them than we can ever know. But let's present the information relevant to the decision to the decision maker. And then we can present scenarios, we can present risk analysis. We present the information to the decision maker, but let them weigh it up in their head and their guts. And that's still, I think, is probably the only practical way to deal with advising farmers about making decisions. And what came out of decision theory, there was one thing I did agree with, was that it is rational, and I think it's reasonable to say rational people would do this. If you're given two choices of an investment, say, with the same risk, it would be rational people would choose the option that gave the highest profit for the same risk. Or if it gives the same profit, rational people would choose the option with the same profit, but the lower risk one. That seems sort of a reasonable assumption. So let's jump ahead now to 2000. In the mid-90s, Dave Pannell and Ross Kingwell and I quite coincidentally presented a paper, as did they, at a risk conference. And we had enough in common, and we were the same age and became good mates. But we had enough in common to put a paper together. And Dave's paper ended up, Dave's component of it, really Dave and Ross, it ended up being one of the best papers that I've ever been associated with, and possibly even one of Dave's best. It's just demonstrated quite clearly that going to the trouble of getting inside people's heads and including their attitude to risk in an analysis made less difference, was less important to the outcome than other changes such as tactical changes, and Ross did a lot of work on that as well. And so we really sort of, first time I think Dave put it in perspective, this obsession with getting inside people's heads and worrying about their attitude to risk and estimating their utility functions. So that was important. But my contribution to that paper was just something I knew from growing up as a kid. I think it was simply that it's getting the big decisions right that matter. That's the risk that I was always focused on. And my criticism of the decision theory stuff that I learned in the 70s at New England was it seemed trivial. You know, it was focused on a paddock, it was focused on the price of lambs and the live weight of lambs and what I call sort of, not trivial really, but the relatively minor tactical decisions that farmers are all over and can cope with under a range of circumstances. And to me, they're not the ones that ought to be the focus. Now, Adam Comrac's on this, he can talk better about it than me. Adam did a wonderful bit of work recently. He looked at thousands of risk studies. He found that nearly 90% of them were focused on single risks. And then of those, 2/3 were production and 13% were market. But most of the risk work that's been done focuses on a single risk. And my view is it's a whole approach, because risks on farms are related to each other and affect each other. There's stochastic relationships between things. So a partial view, looking at what's happening in a paddock, I argue farmers are all over that, and if things go a bit awry, they're all over that too. The big focus, I think, ought to be on what I call strategic risk, and I'll come back to that. Because just continuing with the history, the next bit of news to me really was horse and rabbit stew. James Machan, the great benefit cost analysis, wrote his book on benefit cost analysis, used the term horse and rabbit stew, where in an analysis, the horse is uncertainty. And then I discovered more about uncertainty as I went on. I went back to Frank Knight. In the 1920s, the distinction was made by Knight between uncertainty, where we've got no idea and we can't attach probabilities to it, and risk, where we've got some experience, we can make a reasonable probability distribution about something happening. Knightian and uncertainty. Then Lord Keynes at the same time, John Maynard Keynes at the same time, grappled with the same issue of this uncertainty. And Keynes has summed it up really when he said, we simply do not know. And that's been my mantra ever since, really, although I'll tell you what Keynes said, I wrote it down. Keynes said about uncertainty, right? Business is not a game of roulette where we have probabilities, which the decision theory, I thought, pretended business was a game of roulette where we know the probabilities. Keynes said it's not. He said it's all about uncertainty. We simply do not know. But he said we still need to act. And then what do we do? Because the future is going to happen whether we try and influence it or not. And he said, Keynes said this, I'll read it. He said, we assume the present is a good guide to the future. We ignore the prospects for change because we know nothing about the future. We often assume the current information is a good summary of future prospects. There's a conventional wisdom that emerges. Then he said, now these are ridiculous things to do, but that's what people do in the face of uncertainty when we just simply do not know, because you've got to do something, you've got to act. And then I discovered Kenneth Arrow, and Nobel Prize winner, 2 of his PhD or 3 of his PhD students also won Nobel Prizes, you know, one of the preeminent economists of the last century. Arrow, because I kept thinking, really smart people will solve this problem, right? That we don't know. You know, they'll somehow, there's a way to do it. And when Kenneth Arrow came out and said, I read it, people underestimate uncertainty. What we know about things in society or nature comes trailing clouds of vagueness. And if Kenneth Arrow could do it, I thought, well, that'll do me. I think uncertainty is trumps. And so that's my latest mantra, uncertainty is trumps. And it's not a doctrine of despair at all, because uncertainty is what makes life interesting and fun and opportunities. But let's not pretend we know more than we don't. We know there's a limit to what people can know, is what I'm really saying. And then after Arrow, just to run through my thinking, Peter Bernstein wrote Against the Gods, a great history of risk if anyone's interested. And basically his advice was, because we simply do not know, in running a business, all you can do is minimise your exposure to the risk you can't manage. In Australian agriculture, we can't do much about that. We have enormous exposure to enormous risk, right? But his advice was, well, minimise your exposure, but then manage well the risks you can control. It seems obvious and common sense, doesn't it? I was given a talk last year up at Nigel Kerrin's operation in central New South Wales, the Orange, and it was the time the Indonesian foot and mouth thing was bubbling away. And Nigel's attitude, I thought, was very good, because he said, look, I don't worry about any risks I can't do anything about. He said, I can't do anything about foot and mouth outbreak happening in Indonesia and possibly coming here. He said, I just manage the risks I can control. And related to that, Warren Buffett recently, he said, risk is not knowing what you're doing. And I've always said, the best and first risk management thing is to be really good technically at farming. So, you know, there's a lot of intersections there. Then I discovered Nassim Taleb's black swans, the rare events that have big impacts. And I thought, well, that's pretty good. Those tails of the distribution, some tend to be able to operate within the around the mean, but the tails are the ones that, the big rare events with big impacts are the ones that really need to be coped with. And I like that. And then Paul Dean started doing his PhD on risk in the grains industry, and he introduced me to King and Kay, the idea of radical uncertainty. And I like that a lot. They're saying, look, we've got no data about the future. If we've got no data, we've got no probabilities. What can we do? We said we end up using judgment, but we're going to be disciplined about what we know and disciplined about what we do not know, and really address the question, what is going on here? And then they said, set up your business to be robust to a range of futures that are possible and resilient to the unpredictable. And again, it just really resonated with me, because I've always said many times, good farmers, the best risk managers, set up their businesses to cope with whatever the world may throw at them. And it just, again, it comes back to bleeding obvious common sense. Okay, so I'll just a little bit more and then we'll have questions, okay? I wanted to talk a little bit about decision making, just where it's at, or what I've learned since, you know, I wrote that paper. And now I'll just run through a list and a little bit about RiskWi, and then we'll throw it open, eh? But on decision making and risk, first thing I've learned only in recent years, I've read stuff, behavioural economic stuff, about making decisions. And the first thing is, decision making is a process. And now you've all been in this situation, whether it's at work, it's a committee or something. There's an issue, there's a problem, you need to decide what to do. And you've sat around a table, and instantly people have started solving the problem. Does that resonate with anyone? It happens all the time where I work. Instantly people go to this is how we can fix it. Wrong. First thing you do, I think, is say, how are we going to answer this question? How are we going to solve this problem? Because what information do we need? What's the essence of the issue? Figure out how and then what. That's the first step. But then what I've learned is that we're not rational computing machines at all, as I was told when I went to university. We're actually full of biases. I'm not, of course, but a lot of my mates are. Some of my best friends are biased. But, you know, there's Nobel Prizes here in this stuff. Kahneman and Tversky, you know, prospect theory. If I give you $25, you'll be sort of happy, but if I give you 50 and you lose 25 of it, you'll be even more pissed off. I won't be as happy as if I just gave you 25. It's not symmetrical, the response to a gain and a loss. That affects how we then form our judgments about the likelihood of the success or failure of a venture. Really deserves a Nobel Prize, that. Confirmation bias, we only hear stuff that confirms what I already know. Anchoring, where you start matters. Spurious correlation, this caused that. The rooster crowed this morning, the sun come up because the rooster crowed. You know, that sort of nonsense. Framing, is it an opportunity or a threat? Hindsight's a wonderful thing. Anyone who's been to the races knows that. It's quite obvious after the race why that horse won, even though I didn't back it. Some people just know, other people spend too much time learning and can't make a decision. Dodgy analogues is good. This is really common. Every farmer I know can say, oh, it's just like 72 or it's just like 96, or they've always got a year. It's just like, it's just like, it's just like. Any situation, it's just like. The problem with this just like is they leave out, oh, but this is different. And this is different from the just like. It's a partial view. You've got to think of the whole thing. This is similar, but this is very different. Just like is a real common dodgy thing. Crowds going along to get along, and then wisdom of the crowds not being too wise. The other side of that is two heads are better than one. That's the consultant's role. To me, farmers often, smart farmers always know what they want to do and they've thought it through, but like, gee, they value that sounding board. The final one's intuition. As I say in that paper you read, it's not all it's cracked up to be. Intuition's a wonderful thing, and people with good experience have good intuition and don't need a lot of analysis often. But intuition doesn't cover experiences that you haven't had. Okay, so just remember there's limits of intuition. Finally, to finish with RiskWi, and then we'll throw it open. I don't know much about RiskWi, but I thank Rick Llewellyn for asking me to be involved in this. I just read something recently and said, oh, we're going to focus on nitrogen because it's a big variable cost. Oh, yeah, I thought that's for a start, that's very tactical, very paddock, very partial. But anyway, the point is, the reason nitrogen is a big variable cost is because the benefits are so bloody big. For Christ's sake, it's wonderful stuff. But I've done work on cotton where it's got a benefit cost ratio, marginal value product compared to the total marginal cost of 8:10 to 1. You know, $300 a bin on cotton brings $2,400 worth of cotton, for Christ's sake. Of course, it's a big variable cost, but the benefits are far, far bigger. So you can't just focus on the size of a cost and say, oh, that must be a problem. Anyway, do the same with wheat. Put $150 worth of urea on a crop of wheat, you might pick up another $300 or $400 worth of grain. It's 3 or 4 to 1, that's not bad. Put it in perspective. So I think a focus on the tactical, the partial, price, yield, again, going back to my criticism of decision theory in the 70s, is not the main game. I think stochastic dependencies matter, related risky phenomena matter, rare events. Richard Just, a great American economist, really made a point that resonated with me when he said it's runs of events that matter. People focus on single events, single years. And you think of New South Wales 2017, 18, 19, that was a run of events, that mattered. Lots of farms still haven't recovered. Okay, so these are the big things that I think matter. I don't think it's sensible to look at risks as being independent or partial. I think really it's all about creating choices. You do that by building wealth. That's where your utility comes from. Utility comes from the choices. Choices comes from the wealth. It's the pathway to building that wealth. This is Paul Dean's thesis now. The pathway to building that wealth, the risk associated with that pathway to building wealth that creates the utility, that's the risk that I find most interesting. And I think that's the one we should be looking at, as well as down at the paddock, because I think the paddock is usually well and truly got that under control. It's the big ones. It's the land assets, the machinery assets. It's those big decisions, it's solvency, liquidity. Like I've done a lot of work where I've said, oh, the risk is the variability of the cash flow, annual cash flow. And no, turned out to be no. It's only the risk when you become insolvent or illiquid. That's the risk. It's not the variability per se. I thought that's a very good point. So I would argue short-run problems, the system copes. It's a bigger one, longer run, medium-term issues, which are a more useful focus for our risk. And I think that's probably where I'll leave it. And let's open it up for questions. You can tell me why I'm wrong on pretty much everything I've said.
Thank you very much, Bill. Lots of things and lots of little snippets I think that we could almost record and reflect on a lot throughout the direction of RiskWi's. And I will plug here that Adam was actually our first reading club presenter as well. So anybody that missed that, it is up online to look back over Adam's presentation there. So we've got about half an hour, and I think there is a million questions that have popped up in everybody's mind. But would anybody like to kick off with a question for Bill? If not,
I have a question,
yes.
actually.
Please.
Okay. Oh.
G'day, Mary.
What's your issue with benchmarking, Bill?
That's a Dorothy Dixon. I could send you a little bit of literature about it, but averages, spurious correlation, implied cause and effect. Every farm's different. Every farmer's different. You know, the list a mile long. It's really discredited. You can I think, only compare yourself with yourself to make a firm judgment of what I should do next. Like compare and contrast is always useful, but you know, I won't go on with that because we'll run out of time. But I'm serious, seriously, there's a lot of literature going back to the 70s, which I've used and kept repeating. A lot of economic logic about why benchmarking is a flawed concept, and it's based on averages. You can't derive marginal productivities from it. It's unique. There's no benchmarks for new technology. You know, I've got a list a mile long. I'll send you some papers, Mark.
No, I think it referenced some in this.
I did, yes. Even in that paper, I've been hammering it so long I didn't even bother to go on with it. But it's detailed in my presidential address and in the farming game, the second farming game, and or in a paper, 50 years of farm management in the RMAE in 1989 or something. That's where the argument. But the arguments come from Wilfred Candler and Roger Malden and Schapper. It's not.
I'm asking also because I think it's worth emphasising in this audience.
Yeah, well, I've been telling people forever, but no one listens. Consultants love it, but it's really flawed because it's based on averages and historical and not looking forward and spurious correlation. You can be doing a terrific job with terrible resources and end up bottom of the league's table. You could be a terrible job with terrific resources and be the top of the league's table. All that sort of nonsense. And then, as Paul Dean has shown, simple random effects can put you at the top or bottom of the league's table when they rank them, simply because you got the rain or you didn't, or you fluked the market or you didn't. Totally random, nothing to do with what you've done. There's so many flaws, it's not funny.
Okay, thanks.
Kate, you've got your hand up.
Right, Kate?
You're muted, Kate.
Still muted.
We'll come back to you, Kate. There we are.
Bill, just following on from that, how and yeah, I've got a recent paper I wrote on that topic that I'm happy to send through to you, Brendan, to pass around too. Bill, what about performance analysis of an individual farm over a period of time? You know, that whole concept of comparing yourself with yourself, particularly in a rainfall limited situation where we can actually look at potential performance based on rainfall. Do you
Yeah.
see any value in that? Just
absolutely the most useful thing you could do, Kate, I would have thought. I don't think I know. The most useful thing you can do is understand the performance of your farm and why over time. It's absolutely huge advocate of that, because you've got to understand, as Warren Buffett said, risk comes from not knowing what's going on. The Kay and the other researcher I mentioned about radical uncertainty, their whole mantra was, what is going on here? And to track that over time is absolute gold. So I'd be a huge fan of that. And I've seen the work you've done where you've used that information to then make some, I said, you simply don't know about the future. You've been plotting or tracking developments in the weather and in the soil moisture as the year goes on. That's valuable. That's hugely valuable, because we don't know what's going to happen. The more we know about what is happening and has happened, the better.
So I wonder if there's a legacy in this project in regard to that approach, as opposed to, I think part of the problem is some people think benchmarking is about performance analysis, yet other people use the term for comparative analysis, and both have their place in certain aspects, but it's become...
It's compared with what? The only economics question ever is compared with what? And I just think knowing your own business and comparing your business over time is absolutely... And Roger Molden said that, years ago. Everyone who criticised benchmarking says exactly what you're saying and doing, Kate, which is really understanding your business and picking up trends. Where are we headed here? Because if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there,
I'll jump in and just say I've started to think of benchmarking as a potential, thinking of behavioural economics, Bill, nudge towards analysis. So using benchmarking as the potential nudge that causes people to actually start to chase more information and more.
Yeah, that's interesting, Rick, and it's good. That reminds me, that's what Henry Schaber said in 1971, and he said, when people say, "Oh, it's great because it gets consultants thinking about their farm business," Henry said, "All right, let's just generate random numbers for farmers." And he wrote a paper with that title, which was a seminal paper criticising benchmarking. So, but I do get that a lot. It helps, and it does, I don't deny it. It helps farmers to come together socially and talk about their business, etc., etc. That's a good thing. Don't worry about that. But I can't improve my business much by having a hard look at yours and say, geez, I wish I had a rich farm, But I take your point, though, that anything that gets farmers talking and thinking and learning is a good thing.
We'll move over to James.
Playing devil's advocate.
There's another Mallee troublemaker, this bugger.
That's right, exactly. And completely out of field and unqualified. But is a lot of the problem with benchmarking perhaps its analysis, interpretation rather than the concept itself? For instance, if you benchmark based on resource use efficiency, then I would see that as a useful thing because it's connecting the biophysical to the financial or the economic. So are you turning millimeters of rainfall, or are you turning X value of assets into the amount of money you could be? And I would argue that, yeah, if you're looking at resource use efficiencies, then you're standardizing across environments to some extent.
Yeah, well, part of my answer is exactly my answer to Kate. For your own business, absolutely. But it's historic, right? So economic history is great. I love economic history. I think you can learn from it. But it's averages, and average is a silly measure.
It doesn't have to be averages though, Bill. Like that comes to the analysis and the interpretation. It doesn't have to be averages.
What else is it? It's not marginal. If it was marginal, I'd be agreeing more, because the
You can
marginal
looking at having a large sample size of farm performance data and looking at the distribution within that,
Oh, I see what you mean.
I think is
yeah,
helpful.
yeah, you're talking about large populations and when I say averages, the measures gross margin per head or gross margin per hectare, they're always averages which are not very useful for making decisions. You're talking about averages of a population.
Yeah,
And that has the role for policy type measures and stuff like that. It's nice to know where the distribution is. That 20% of farmers make 80% of output, all that sort of information. That's fine. But I've never, when I'm talking benchmark, I'm talking, I get 10 bags a week to the acre and James gets 15, and bloody hell, James is a good farmer and I'm a bad one and I should do what James does. That sort of stuff.
yeah, but
Traditional
it's,
benchmarking meant comparing the same activity in two different businesses.
if you can standardise across the businesses. So if we go to Kate's book and the central thesis that farmers that are good, well, good farmers that are making money are those that understand their resources and how to get the most value, to how to use them efficiently. So if you have a benchmark of efficiency of a given resource, that's a value.
My response to that is when you look at the data, let's say I look at 10 years of benchmark data for Dairy Farm Monitor or something, no farmer is in the top 2 or 3 more than 2 or 3 times. The random effects of good rainfall, good milk price, disease, whatever, the random effects just throws them all over the place. There's no consistency. Very rarely is someone consistently in the top couple, right? It's the random element is really swamps. It's that horse and rabbit stew thing again. The randomness just throws it about. And
is it randomness or climate variability? Because you can standardise for climate.
Well, you've got to go back to what rainfall there was, when it was, etc., and what market you flew, what week you sold, etc. Put it all together, and you might get a high return on capital.
Yeah,
it's
so
slightly
that's
different, and you get the bottom of the return on capital.
That's a
Those
useful
effects are
exercise to
random
go through, isn't it?
Eh?
That's a useful exercise to go through, isn't it?
Well, there's a lot of useful exercise. It just depends what the opportunity cost is.
True. Okay.
I think it's more useful to sit down with a farmer and walk their farm and say, now, how have we been going? What are our goals? Where are we headed? What have we got to work with? You know, what do you feel about this? What if this happened? What if you're wrong? You know, I'm very much, you can only do farm management on a one-to-one basis, really.
You can damn yourself to mediocrity though, Bill, if you don't aspire to the stars.
Oh no, I'm all for dreaming. Look at the champion bullock driver. He's my hero, James. So I take your point. And clearly you need to know what's possible. And that's what Jack Malcom always said to me. Part of his job often was raising his clients' sights because he said they didn't realise what was possible. And that's where I'm a huge fan of the good consultant. That's why I talked about the sounding board. And I see that as the consultant's role.
But that's a bit like Rick's comment, isn't it? That, you know, you can learn something from benchmarking that might prompt you to think more deeply, or in this case, to aim higher or something. But I'm with Bill that it's very difficult to learn much that's directly applicable to your own farm from somebody else's performance. But it could be a trigger.
We're ticking off as part of book club. We like to have the big discussion. So want to continue ruminating on a difference of opinion is good, and we'll continue to discuss that one. But I might move to Ben now.
Right, Bill. I noticed you mentioned Nassim Taleb's book, The Black Swan, and I think black swans is a great topic we could explore within RiskWi. But wondering if you've read his next book, Anti-Fragile.
I read a second one after Black Swan, but not that recent one. No, I haven't.
Okay, so Anti-Fragile, we all know what fragile is. You drop something and it breaks. Robust is when you drop something and it doesn't break. But anti-fragile is when you drop something and it gets stronger. And so coming from a share trading point of view, you know, he talks about how you could make a lot of money when others go backwards. And, that's not the central premise of it, but are there opportunities in agriculture to gain from disorder, as he puts it?
Well, I think I'm really relying on blokes like Peter Bernstein, who was a trader in New York for his career and wrote Against the Gods. But he actually, his theme of his book was risk's a great thing, because how dull and boring it would be if everything was just the same all the time. And the risk creates the opportunities. And Kay and the other guy, King, they make the same point about uncertainty. It's the uncertainty and risk that creates the opportunities. So, and that would be what the Black Swan man would be saying too. But I used the word framing of a question before, whether it's seen as an opportunity or a threat. And so risk and uncertainty, they're a fact of life. But a lot of my science colleagues think it's something to be minimised, have a defensive view. And I say, well, if you remove risk, you remove profit. So if you want a low risk life, it's all right. There's no money in it. And so when my colleagues talk about reducing the risk, I talk about managing risk. They talk about reducing it. That's fine. You can diversify, but you've got to accept you'll have a lower income, because it's a risk that creates the income. So I think we're in furious agreement, Ben.
Yeah, and I think one of the concepts is, take a drought, and we all talk about how we can survive the drought. But in the concept of anti-fragile, you would be talking about how you can actually come out of a drought in front.
I've had farmers tell me they make all their money, historically, they made all their money during drought. Okay, so yeah, how smart some of those blokes and women out there farming are, to be act in a counter-cyclical way, be set up, when the bad times come, they set themselves up. It's not that uncommon a story,
Yep. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. And we'll throw back to the West with Faye.
Thanks, Bill, for that very interesting and very thought-provoking discussion and presentation. So I apologize, I have to go back a little bit on the benchmarking, because while I agree with you that benchmarking is not perfect, it does in behavioral economics, it does play a role, because it can often be used as a tool to influence behavior by capitalizing on our people's inherent desire to conform to social norms, or outperform peers. And in fact, talking to some of the ARGs when we were trying to discuss with them, the panel that we are planning for RiskWi, several of them have already said, can we benchmark, so that, as something that they can get back from the panel, while we're collecting baseline information. But I see, it makes me think really that with this benchmarking, it is critical to identify what do we benchmark with. So I agree that, benchmarking probably with other farmers is not really the best, but depending on how we choose the benchmarking indicator, it should be something that, it reminds me of, there's really no such thing as an average farmer, but there is a representative farmer. But how do you get that representative farmer? So it should be very close to, to your farm. But how do you identify that representative farmer? So for example, just getting a national benchmark won't make sense, because they have different, conditions, they have different price risk that they're facing, and production risk. So it really has, if you benchmark, it has to be with either in your own farm, your performance with your own farm, or something that's very similar to your farm, maybe in your same farming systems, same conditions. But I guess the challenge for us practitioners is how to identify that. So I have no answer. It's more questions, I suppose.
Well, my response would be every farmer is different, with different goals, different depth, different attitude to risk. And there's already farmers out there who already know how to farm better than they do, because that's not their main goal. They're all got different goals, so that's why I can't sort of come at any sensible comparison that can help me. That we got different goals, we're trying to achieve different things with different resources. So an opportunity cost comes into it. Why wouldn't we be better off doing proper farm economics, teaching people how to think about making a decision, thinking about response functions, thinking about the economic way of thinking, the marginal way of thinking, not averages, marginal thinking. That to me, and good farmers do it intuitively, that to me would be much more productive than looking in the rear vision mirror and hoping to Christ I can see where I'm going.
It does have some, for example, I'm now thinking like, how was it used in other disciplines, like in energy consumption, on health behavior, workplace performance, for example.
So we're not
But I
putting the
guess
discussion
farming is-
back to risk because it's turning
But
into
I
a
just mean, like-
benchmarking discussion.
Yeah.
It came out of controlled environment factories.
Yes.
Xerox comparing the performance of this factory against the other one doing exactly the same thing in a controlled environment.
Yeah. Agriculture is
sense.
more complex.
And the firm had one goal, making profits. That made sense. Nothing remotely like farming as I know.
Can I just jump in there for a second? As someone who's done a fair bit of thinking about this, the difference between Xerox and I think the next company that used it might have been IBM, but happy to be corrected if I'm wrong. As you say, Bill, they were totally interested in what it meant for their company and to improve their bottom line. It wasn't, it was the interpretation was what they were trying to get out of it. And where I see it go wrong in the real world is when the ratios are created and then people start to agonise over the fact of whether they've met a ratio or not. And as Bill said, that's that ranking that may not actually be a viable comparison. So, for example, in South Australia last year, if the last couple of years, and you've got a benchmarking group of data ranked by return on equity, farms in the EP, the Eyre Peninsula with lower land prices, we're all ranked a lot higher than other farms, yet their net profits weren't that different. So it's really misleading data, and that's the problem. But I agree with you that using it as an incentive is really good, but we've just got to call it something else, because benchmarking in Australian ag is known as a comparative thing rather than a performance analysis thing, in my view.
If benchmarking is the answer, what's the bloody question would be my response. There's already well-known methods to tackle serious questions about farm management, and I would be putting the efforts into those, not these bloody sideshows.
Adam, are you a benchmarking or otherwise question? Shoot.
Otherwise?
Shoot extra then.
Okay, sure. So Bill, you mentioned the importance of getting big decisions right, like investing in non-current assets like land and machinery. I'm just thinking about what methods are available to do that, considering risk, like especially when researchers don't really know equity and wealth positions of businesses. You can use capital budgeting and discounted cash flows, but they normally just result in one final value. And how do you sort of represent variability in those longer term decisions you're trying to make for big investments? Any thoughts?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I used to think, well, the theory is all there, and we just use the budgeting tools. Then I discovered that some of the biggest firms on earth basically don't do anything very sophisticated at all. It's pretty crude, but I just think getting the technical basis of the decision right, getting that bit right, thinking about the possible range of outcomes, the range of prices that might apply, taking account of correlations that are going to impact on this investment. They were buying land, getting those stochastically related effects in the numbers. Like I actually do budgets, and I do use that risk, and I put probabilities in there and correlations, and I do that standard stuff. And then I come back and say, look, 60% chance you should earn 7.5 or 8% over the life of this investment. How's that grab you? And you know, we've got all the risks that we could identify in there, but we haven't got uncertainty in there. So then that's one bit of information. I think that's useful information, but it doesn't make the decision, but it informs the decision. Because then there's other things like, well, my real goal is I have to buy this place, I've got to set the kids up, etc., 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 right? So I still think the standard capital budgeting, standard risk techniques, price and yield variabilities, interest rate variabilities, inflation possibilities, and I like a couple of discrete scenarios where you say, well, what if I'm wrong about the most likely? What if this was to happen? And only 2 to 3 scenarios that you can only assimilate a couple, right? So not a million scenarios, but a couple of really rigorous scenarios about what the future might look like to inform my judgment about the investment. So I still stick with the standard capital budgeting theory and risk theory, and but it really comes down to 2 or 3 very well thought out discrete scenarios where you've considered what if I'm wrong, where you've considered, Jesus, if the wheels really fell off and all this and this extreme, one case can be what's the worst that could happen? And if the worst that could happen is something you can live with, that might be enough for you to go ahead. So it's the standard methods, discrete scenarios, well thought out, and judgment. Nothing more. And I thought there'd be a better answer than that, but I found Kenneth Arrow didn't have one, so I gave up.
Stick with that and save some more money maybe, because the biggest risks you can't predict, like in the last 20 years. The probably most crazy things have been COVID-19 and the 9/11 terrorist attacks, and the day before no one would have seen them coming. So,
and well,
put more cash in the bank.
When the Russians shot that plane down over Ukraine, I think before they invaded a few years ago, Australian dairy farmers really suffered. How did that happen? There was an embargo on exports of European mountain of dairy products to Russia. It all ended up over here, and our milk solids price halved. You know, how random's that, for Christ's sake? So your business has to be resilient. So when you've made this purchase, we're weighing up the purchase. Is my business resilient to whatever the world can throw at me, really?
Okay,
but it comes down to judgment. There's no answer is 42. If the answer is 42, you're a fraud.
I'll remember that. Thanks.
Now, Bill, your paper's well over 20 years old now, chock full of recommendations, very practical recommendations, the sort of practical recommendations that RiskWi is aiming to pursue. Which ones do you think have been ticked off over that time? Which have been proven to be a dead end or redundant, and which ones do you think are the most important ones to pursue when you've got an initiative like this?
Rick, I'm going to, after this bloody talk going on about bloody benchmarking, for Christ's sake, I'm just going to give up in despair. Jack Makin used to say to me, nil desperandum, right? Well, I'm just about to succumb because, you know, no progress on that front, right? The discrediting of that approach, obviously, from this talk, even though some of you, I think, get it, but I'm a bit worried about that. What progress has been made? Well, I think the real progress, Rick, is stuff not in that paper, but in understanding this human side, that people aren't rational calculating machines. And it sounds funny to say it now, but that was the 1970s economics and decision theory. And you think, geez, that's absurd. But so I think real progress on the behavioural human behaviour front. And as Dylan said, Dylan sort of gave up on economics eventually after his career. He said, oh, it's all too human a process for that. So, and I really took that to heart. So, you know, I think developments along there are promising. The Widdershins, I love these old words, the Widdershins, which is a dead end, they're still there, and they're still being pursued with some bloody vigour by the RDCs. They're a disgrace, right? The way listening to me, RDCs, the way good simple farm economics is really a novelty instead of, you know, oh, that's quite useful. We ought to sort of help people do that. We end up going down the wrong track. I said it in the recent, well, probably the 4 or 5 major papers since this one have said the same thing. The presidential address was the core discipline of farm management analysis has gone missing. Where's the economics? And I can pick up a paper any day of the week and say the same thing. So I'm not a counsel of despair, but because I think we're making some headway in understanding that people are actually people and individuals and all that stuff. But I still, the fact I have to stand here today and say, 30 million is a big investment in a paddock, and I think it's not going to send you broke, but the big questions will. Why don't we look at the bigger questions? That suggests to me that we haven't made enormous headway since I started 50 years ago. So, no wonder Dylan gave up and said, no, it's all too hard.
Well, you'll be pleased to know that nitrogen is only one of potentially 5 themes in RiskWi's bill. So there are the bigger picture ones coming around the corner.
No, I knew it was in good hands, Rick. And it would be derelict in our duty not to look at some of the bigger picture stuff, is my argument.
Excellent. Well, we're closing out now. I think there's been some good discussion, some learnings. I certainly learnt a lot as well, and a few takeaways that will help with the direction of RiskWi's as well. So a big thank you to Bill for taking on the challenge, not knowing much about RiskWi's, but willing to come in and present and have a really great, robust discussion as well. Everybody else, thanks for joining. And as always, if you've got a suggestion for our 5th reading club, please send it my way. Thanks, everybody. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you. Happy reading, everyone.
Thanks,
you.
Bill.
Thanks,
Thanks, Bill. Thanks, everyone. That's great.
Thanks, Bill.
Okay.